Hey guys, it's Bridget with San Jose Seed Company, and today we're on the farm and I'm going to be talking all about dwarf tomato plants. And I really want to take time to differentiate these from other tomato varieties or tomato types so that you can understand why are they different, why may or may they not haven't had my coffee this morning, why they may or may not work for you in your garden, and what you need to know to be successful at growing them. These are the 4 things that you really need to know to understand dwarf tomatoes. So the first thing that you should be aware when growing dwarf tomatoes is growing conditions. Now, luckily this is relatively easy because these are just like any tomato in that they love all the things that any tomato variety loves. And the biggest factor, especially if you're a new gardener, is look around. There is literally no shade. This is absolute full sun. Tomatoes and Solanaceae crops really love sunlight. It's in the name. Solanaceae, sol, sun, right? They love sunlight and they want full sun. They're not going to thrive if they're grown in part shade or in an area, if you're in an urban space, that doesn't get full hours of sunlight. This is actually southern exposure. So the sun rises in the east, sets in the west, and this field and all of our fields are exposed to sun all day long. Now that kind of plays into the other things you want to think about with growing conditions, because they're in full sun all the time, and especially where we are in zone 9 or 10, it's hot. So you need to make sure that you have good soil. Our soil here, it's what I would qualify as farm soil. It's not great. We're working on it. It takes time. We've got 4 acres. It's a lot of work to amend that much soil. But the things that we've added to this soil to make these beautiful plants grow are compost, number 1. It is a moisture retaining amendment that's really important in zone 9 and 10. We've added fertilizer. An organic granular fertilizer is great for any heavy feeding crop. Tomatoes are one of them. We've added manure. We love horse manure because of its water holding capacities. It really will hold a lot of moisture in the soil, which is what we need in our particular climate. So all of those things we're adding and we're amending to the soil to make sure that our plants can grow and thrive in the heat that we experience. Now let's say you're gonna grow a dwarf tomato in a pot, which would totally make sense because these guys are so great and compact and small that you could do them on a pot, on a patio, on a balcony, in the garden. You wanna use high quality potting mix. And I always tell our gardeners that the potting mix alone isn't enough. Getting high quality potting mix is the first step, but then still adding all the things I mentioned will make really any crop thrive, but particularly tomatoes. That's a organic granular fertilizer, compost, Bermuda-free horse manure will make all the difference in that pot's ability to hold on to moisture and allow your plants to really thrive, especially between waterings if you're hand watering. The flip side of this, let's say you're in zone 9 and 10, but like you're in Florida, right? Okay, you don't have to worry about water as much. Well, at least the lack of it, because you get lots of rain and there's a lot of moisture in the ground. Tomato crops don't like to sit in boggy conditions, so drainage is important. Now, all of the things I mentioned will help the soil drain better, but if you're a first-time gardener and you've never grown a tomato plant before and you're gonna try dwarfs because your space will allow it, first thing to consider is to make sure that the pot that you're putting it in has drainage holes. The moisture has to escape. And you also can't have these plants just sitting in stagnant water. It will rot the roots, they will not be happy. And that goes for most vegetable crops. So make sure drainage is thought about when you are planting them. Now the beautiful thing about compost is it has lots of different particle sizes, which means oxygen can get in there and drainage can happen. If you are planting in soil that is particularly bad, like lots of clay, using a perlite or vermiculite in a potting mix will really help. But these guys don't want to just sit in moisture and rot their roots. You'll not get happy plants that way. Okay, so the second thing that you need to know about dwarf tomatoes that really differentiates them from all of other tomatoes is their size. It's in the name, people. It's, you know, not that surprising. They're dwarf. Now, I've said it a million times and I'm gonna have to keep explaining it because there's a lot of confusion out there. Dwarf refers to the size of the plant, not necessarily the tomato. Within the category of dwarf tomatoes, there's tons of different sizes, from little small cherries to saladettes to grapes to very large slicers. In fact, these are just setting their fruit, so it's going to take some time, but these will be very large, beautiful slicers. This is our chocolate lightning. But the plant itself is small and compact. That's why we fell in love with them in general. When you are using a structure to hold this plant up, you really don't need much. In fact, you can see we've got one wobbly, tiny little 1-inch stake that is holding this tomato plant up. You don't need something really large like you would for an indeterminate tomato. Or another system that wouldn't work would be like the low and lean. Not a great candidate for this particular type of tomato. Really, you need very little structure, which is the whole reason why we love them, right? Who's got time to build this like crazy structure that lets your plants get 12 feet tall? Well, apparently we do, because we're gonna go look at some, and you can see the difference of why you don't want a structure like that, and it's perfectly acceptable to just use one stake. This is the Missouri weave because we have a long row of them, but if you were growing them in a pot, you literally could put 1 or 2 stakes and tie them to it. You could actually, I hate tomato cages, but you could actually potentially use a good sized tomato cage with these types of tomatoes because they stay so small. So let's go look at a couple different trellising systems, and you can see the size of this plant isn't going to need something massive like we have on the other part of the farm. Here's an example of what you wouldn't want to do for a dwarf tomato. We've put up a massive amount of material to hold these guys up. This is an indeterminate pole tomato is what the term is, and it's because the plant grows so big, it's so large, it needs so much trellising material, and this is just completely unnecessary for a dwarf tomato. The plant doesn't get that big, it's much more compact. Another good example is over here. Look how huge this thing is. This thing is massive. This is a homemade tomato cage, and it's so big, this would be totally overkill for what you would need for a dwarf tomato. So again, I think I'm making my point here. The reason why we love these plants is you can grow them in a small space. They don't take a lot of room. A container is great, patio, balcony, and they don't need a lot of trellising to keep them up. You can use simply the staking system, or Missouri weave would be great, but they're also not a candidate for the low and lean system, which is better for larger pole tomatoes like these. Tip number 3 for dwarf tomatoes, and what makes them so different from regular tomatoes, is how you prune them. Now, this is an easy category to go over because you don't do a lot of pruning. That's the beauty. They're really very self-sufficient plants. The only time you would prune a dwarf tomato plant is if you're pruning for airflow, particularly those of you who are in the fog belts or in any areas of zone 9 and 10 that gets a lot of fog and a lot of powdery mildew. You can prune starting at the bottom up to get good airflow, which will help with diseases. The other thing you can do is prune when you have plants that are simply out of control. Like this particular arm of this plant has actually fallen out of our Missouri weave, so you can choose to either prune that off or try to get it inside. Now, what you're looking at here is a farm setting. You're not likely to have a 75-foot row of dwarf tomatoes, or maybe you are, and that's awesome. In that case, you would use something like this Missouri weave to keep them up. But typically in the garden setting, you're gonna have one plant and you're gonna prune for airflow. You're gonna prune for shape if things are falling off, but you're not necessarily going to prune suckers like you would for a indeterminate or a pole variety. That's because these plants have been bred, they've been selected to be short, tiny little Christmas trees, and to give you a lot of tomatoes on one single plant. You can keep it small if you want. Most of our dwarfs, and you'll look across the farm, none of them really get more than about 4, max 5 feet. So we don't prune them because it's time consuming, and the value of what you get out of that time pruning isn't really worth it. Number 4, harvesting for dwarf tomatoes. How is it different from regular tomatoes? Well, there's a lot of similarity in that you always want to check and see on the back of the pack it's going to say is it indeterminate or determinate. For those of you who are beginning gardeners, determinate varieties will give all of their tomatoes more or less at once, and they're all kind of ripen. Indeterminates will give you tomatoes over a long period of time. Dwarf, the category of dwarf tomatoes have both of them, so you'll want to check and see. When you come upon your plant and you're looking and you're seeing, obviously these guys are nowhere near, and we don't actually have any dwarf tomatoes that are ready to harvest quite yet. We are in late July, and we in a couple weeks we're going to have a lot. But I will tell you, a key to harvesting them on dwarf plants is because the plant is so small and bred to be compact, you really want to avoid damaging it when you're pulling your tomatoes off. So for example, on here, let's say these were ripe, you know, these were a beautiful red color, they're ready to harvest. If you come in here and you start yanking the tomatoes off and breaking a lot of these branches, you're doing a lot of damage to the plant because the plant is not going to get that big and it's not going to recover as quickly. So I always want to recommend that you actually just take your pruners and you trim these to take them off to avoid extra damage. The plant is going to be loaded with tomatoes, and so you want to harvest regularly and consistently. Unlike an indeterminate pole tomato where you might get one, a couple weeks later you get another, you need to harvest regularly because they can become so laden with fruit that they will actually break their branches. They'll just snap off and fall right down. So stay on top of pruning, harvest as soon as they're ready. The usual telltale sign is they've colored up to look like the variety that you are growing, and they have a little give to them. They're a little bit soft. A tomato is always best when it's left to ripen on the vine, but if you have heavy pest pressure, you can harvest them a little bit early and ripen them on the counter. They won't be as good, but at least they'll be edible. All right, before we end this video, I want to encourage you guys to like and subscribe to our video channel if you're in zone 9 and 10, or even if you're outside of zone 9 and 10, so that you can learn lots of great gardening advice to do in a small space with varieties that we love here at San Diego Seed Company. Now, we've talked about 4 factors to consider when you're growing dwarf tomato varieties, and hopefully I've encouraged you to check out this new and exciting category of tomatoes that makes it easy, it's space saving, and it can give you incredibly flavored tomatoes to try in your garden.